you know, what's that?
Yeah, recording in progress, it says.
Okay. And that was a kind of to me, it was a dramatic experience because I was going to a different culture and a different language. Again, my father was transferred to Tokyo.
Mhm.
So I went to international school and it was a US run school. So obviously the next destination was university in the US. Uh, and I worked in the US for a few years until Uncle Sam kicked me out. So I said, okay, they don't want me, I'll go to Canada. And at that time, in 1976, it was very easy to become an independent immigrant in Canada.
Yeah, yeah.
And that's where I've been all these years, except for maybe 8 or 9 years when I went in the 80s, when I went to Saudi Arabia. I worked in Saudi Arabia. I went back to Japan to work, and then I went back to Hong Kong to work. uh, and uh, and and then back to Canada in the 90s. Uh, but so the my background is basically very diasporic. In other words, you know, up to 18 years of my life, I've been gone through boundaries. Hence, one of my films called Beyond Frontiers, because you're transcending frontiers and cultures and the language and so that's my upbringing. So when I started the Asian Indian magazine, it was meant to be a Pan Asian kind of identity. I wanted to um, uh, get ourselves identify as Canadians but Asian descent, and it was asserting our as identity that we were doing. And one of the things was that I've always talked to the co-founder of Asian Indian is Tony Chan, and he and I would always talk about, well, we should do a Chinese restaurant documentary because as a traveler, I've always want to have Chinese food wherever I go, and then of course behind every restaurant there are great stories, how the owner got there, or how whether they were born there or they just immigrated there or they took refuge or exile, whatever the case might be. So I thought that not only because food is also very universal, Chinese restaurants are very universal. You can find them anywhere, everywhere, including small town Saskatchewan.
Yeah.
And so that's the impetus for the Chinese restaurants series.
Thank you, Chuck. Now, my second question is, what were involved in making these episodes? How did you pick which city, country to visit?
Yeah.
Did you have a film crew and a production team?
Um, the uh, the choice of location are pretty. I have a I have a problem. I do not like to travel to places I know, or I'm a photographer as well, so I've never wanted to take photographs of places that I know. So I always find my best work when I go to a different country that I've never been to. Like I traveled to the Middle East, I traveled to India the first time, and Iran and so forth. And these are exciting places to me. So it sort of inspires me in terms of being a photographer. So, and if you want me to go to London or go to San Francisco, I would find very boring because it's very cliche, very. So that's why I wanted to pick places that are interesting and not cliche. Uh, and of course, the I know the Noisy Jim. I met him about maybe a year or two before, actually about 3 years before I landed in Saskatchewan again. Uh, but that's because prior to that, I was traveling around Alberta and Saskatchewan, and Noisy Jim was actually in my friend's documentary called Rural Cafe in Saskatchewan. my friend Tony Chan, who co-founded the magazine with me. So I've known about him from Tony Chan, and I looked him up, and I went to Outlook and met him and for a day, and then I traveled around the rest of the province. So he was my first choice because he is such an interesting character. So that's the other criteria. If you go to a place, it might be exotic or might be interesting to me, but if your storyteller, the owner of the cafe or the owner of the restaurant is not as interesting, remember I'm doing a TV show, so attention span is very, very, short. So you don't want to put somebody who's very boring and some, I hate to say it, but it's photogenic. That person has to be photogenic so that it comes on lively on screen and not a very dull person on screen, no matter how good a backstory that you have. So those are the two criteria. And what I've done in all places is I would kind of comes to mind because I've heard of these things, I heard of that thing, and I said I want to do something in the Amazon. And I've never been to South America before I shoot this film, but I've always wanted to go to Argentina to dance the tango. And I'm also fascinated by Brazil and from the soccer Brazil. And also when I'm in Brazil, I say, hey, there's Amazon there. I better go check it out. So that's how I pick these places. And I once I hone in on the country, I would go there, but almost always with references. That's because, as you and I know, Vancouver and Toronto are big multicultural cities with people from everywhere. And there's a whole I say, population of people of Chinese descent from everywhere around the world. So just to give you an example, South African Chinese, Jamaican Chinese, there are a lot of them in Vancouver as well. So in that sense, I always kind of know people. Like my next door neighbor, not my office neighbor, was a Sino-Mauritian. So I would say hello to him, for years, and then suddenly I said, okay, I want to go to Mauritius. So he would introduce me to his sister-in-law, who would introduce me to her brother-in-law. And then, of course, her brother-in-law is the chairman of so-and-so association. And then, so the first day I landed in Mauritius, on my first trip, that's always my research trip that I go by myself. I would have a notebook in hand. I would say, okay, take me to the community. So they would all gather in a dim sum place in Chinatown, in Mauritius Chinatown. And then we would, and he would introduce me to all these people, so-and-so is the president of the Chan Association or the Buddhist temple or wherever it may be. So that's how I kind of parlay my connection from Toronto into places like that. And for example, I asked, I didn't know anybody from Trinidad, but one of my staff is kind of a Trinidadian. So she said, I told her when she was going back for Christmas one year to vacation. So I said, find me a Chinese restaurant. So she did. She found the most famous Chinese restaurant in Trinidad. And then she came back, and it turned out this guy is also a Canadian resident because his family's moved to Canada in the 70s. So all his family's in here, except that he goes back to Trinidad with his wife, and then they run the restaurant there. So it's all that kind of little connection. And then the connection into Argentina was actually interesting. It comes from my connection to Brazil. And my connection to Brazil comes from 6 degrees of separation. It's my sister in Hong Kong, friend in Vancouver, who has a step aunt or step aunt in Sao Paulo. No, in Rio de Janeiro. So I was looking. She's not a restaurant owner, so okay, that's fine. At least I get to her, and then she would say, I have a stepson in Argentina. You should go check him out. So that's how. So that's the 6th degree of separation that I got to my Argentinian tango dancing Chinese restaurant owner. Except Argentina was a little bit too far away. So there were 2 places I didn't go, Argentina and Norway in the Arctic Circle for research. But what I did was I asked my cinematographer by that time, his name's Kwan. This was like 2nd, 3rd year in the team. So I said, Kwan, and at that time, Kwan had a cyber girlfriend. He met her through cyber. He never met her in real life, just cyber. And I was just joking with her about, well, are you having cyber sex with this girlfriend? I said, well, I don't know. Anyway, so.
The 90s, so that's very early.
No. This is 2000.
Okay.
This is 2000 that I've been doing this. So I said, why don't I give you a plane ticket? You go see her, and but find me a Chinese restaurant owner. So that's how he found me the Chinese restaurant owner, because he got to Argentina, Buenos Aires. He asked around and found me somebody. And then that's how I do my research. And then once I've done my research, then once I get to the country, I hone in on a restaurant. I'll try to find somebody photogenic, as I said. The interesting story about Mauritius was I didn't find that person until 4 hours before my flight to leave Mauritius. I was honing on somebody else, but I still felt that he was a little bit too boring and not really photogenic. And then somebody came to the hotel and says, oh, I heard you're looking for a good Chinese restaurant. No, come to my brother-in-law's place. So I quickly jumped on a taxi, went there took an hour to get to this little village. And I found the right person. I quickly got back to the hotel and got to the airport and got on my flight. So, and then of course, when I'm ready to shoot, in Africa's case, I combined South Africa, Mauritius, and Madagascar in one trip. So we went to 3 places. So when I've booked my crew, then I will call them up and say, would you be free this week or that week? And then can I come and film you and this and that? So my crew is, at first it started with 2 people, me and Kwa. Kwa is my cinematographer for all 4 years of the project. He's basically the eyes and ears of me. And then of course, and then halfway, about 2 countries into it, we needed an assistant. So we need somebody to do sound. So we need a sound assistant. So we brought in a 3rd person. And that role have about 3 people playing that role. Each of them went to 3 or 4 countries with us, and then we got another one. So to answer your question, it was a crew of 3. And I mean, the traveling was very exciting. I mean, we don't have the budget to stay in 5-star hotels, so we always so it's all and then of course I'm writing a book about my adventures, and in there it's called Have You Eaten Yet? It's going to be published next Chinese New Year from Douglas McIntyre, which is the Vancouver publisher. And in there I talk a lot of stories that I didn't bother telling in the film, just because film is a half-an-hour episode, as you see, that you know, a lot of details that you don't talk about. And you know, we got caught by Israeli security, got detained by so-and-so, you know, we got our film confiscated and all this stuff. So all these little ventures that we've done, it makes for a pretty exciting travel.
Yeah, I noticed the films are very fast-paced, and very interesting, very active, and obviously the food is delicious. And then you're right, the characters of the restaurant operators are very interesting, very colorful people. My next question is, could you share with us some of the interesting encounters that you experienced while you were on this trips?
In what sense?
Interesting, just odd that maybe something you're not able to include in the film, but left you with a deep impression, affected you.
I try to put all my deep impression into my writing of the film. When I come back, don't forget I take about we shoot about 30 hours, and then per restaurant, and then so you shrink it down to half an hour. So that's almost like a 50-61 ratio. So for every 1 hour of film of what you see on TV, we shot about 50-60 hours of film. So I can tell you that I've obviously picked the most condensed and most interesting story. So it's a matter of weaving the story. Some of them have different characters, as you don't have that in Canada, but in other places we have other characters that come in and out. That serves as a chorus to give the context of the story. So you're not just facing one person or one family. You also have family members. And of course, my formula is always that I always go to the next generation, because this is where I talk about identity, assimilation, integrate, how you fit into the country. And I love foreign films, so I love hearing Chinese speaking, Spanish, Swedish, Norwegian, whatever it may be. So I will always have this dream about, I'm a Swedish film director, Ingmar Bergman, and I'm interviewing some Chinese woman speaking Swedish on film. So these are pretty kind of interesting things. What I found very impressive was what I then put on the film. These are background stories that, it's not central to the character. It's not central to the understanding of what the story was, but it's very, very kind of enlightening. And I put those stories now in my book. For example, my Cuban guy, he was working in Hong Kong. He left his family of four children and a wife in the village in Guangdong somewhere. And then he went to Hong Kong to work in a film studio. It was one of these Chinese film studio, but it was a film studio with American control. So it was during McCarthyism. So he was being red hunted by the Americans, being like sympathizing with, communism. So I asked him point blank in the film, I said, "Are you a communist?" And she said, "No. I'm just I sympathize with them, but I'm not a communist." Okay, so that's interesting because I'm asking this question in Cuba, right? So he had to leave, and he had some uncles in San Francisco or California, but he couldn't go because Americans won't let him go there because he's communist. So he ended up in Cuba. And so the story was, of course, he jumps from one revolution to another revolution because he came in the 50s before Castro took over. And then when Castro took over, he lost all his business and that kind of thing. But the interesting story was that he had a girlfriend in Hong Kong. It was a starlet. She was beautiful. I saw her picture. And then she wanted him to take him. She wanted him to take her to Cuba. And then she said, "I'll take you there once I settle down." Of course, once he settled down, he doesn't have the money. He doesn't. And then and I'm not sure I put it in the film, but in my book, I will talk about him saying, look, I have a wife and 4 kids in village. I can take you here, and so it was a very passionate love story, and he admits to it off on the tape but I didn't never put them in the story. He said, "Oh, that was my only true love in life. I regretted not bringing her to Cuba." And I said, "What happened to her?" She said, "Oh, after a few years waiting, she got tired. She married somebody in New York." So it's that kind of you all read about these stories, from Chinese Canadians who have, people left their wives in the village, came here. I know of 3 people, including one of my relatives, an uncle, who actually has somebody in the village that he never told his second wife in Canada, right? And so it's that kind of stories that are the backstories that are not central to your Chinese restaurant story, but the thing is that it informs about the experience of life, So these are kind of very interesting story. And if I would pick my favorite episode, that would be Cuba, because if you have a chance, go see my Cuban episode. It's got a Chinese, Cuban, Frank Sinatra in there. He sings love songs in Cuba in Spanish. He was born in Cuba. His name is Fermin, and he sings like the Buena Vista Social Club type songs, Cuban love songs, Cuban ballads, and salsa, and he danced the mambo and all that stuff. And so anyway, he's quite a character. So this is the kind of thing that I put in because he's friend of the owner, and he comes to the restaurant there. So, by itself, he's a singer. It doesn't have anything to do with my restaurant story. However, it informs give it the context of Cuba. And then, of course, the other story that I want to always like to tell is that you'll see in the film, actually, is I found long lost relatives in Cuba. I went to the cemetery and found a lot of Kwans from my village, from my grandfather's village. So who knows? Some of them could be my relatives buried in Havana. So because I heard from my grandfather that many Kwans actually left for Cuba. I went to Cuba in the 50s and 40s. So in that sense, it's likely that I would have relatives in Cuba that I never knew about. So.
Yeah, there's a lot of Kwans in Canada as well. Lots of Kwans in Canada as well.
Yeah, but not as much as Cuba.
Oh, really?
Because the people from my grandfather's village all left in abundance, en masse to Cuba. For some reason, once a Kwan get there, and they'll put the next one in, the cousin in, the all that kind of stuff. So
that's right.
That's some of these immigration story that we talk about. Yeah.
That leads me to a next question. It's about language. That when you go to all these places, that you encounter all different languages, and also how do people there take you, being a Chinese and yet you're Canadian? How do they?
Language first. Obviously, you all know that Chinese have different dialects. So the Mauritius one is very interesting because they speak Hakka. They're Hakka people, and I don't speak Hakka. I speak Cantonese and Mandarin. So the only way and then she doesn't speak English much. As you know, the national language of Mauritius is actually French. So and Creole. So I speak French from my high school days. So not very well, but I still understand and speak it. So I would interview her in French. In Spanish country, I would need an interpreter. I would usually have somebody who. I brought somebody from the U.S. to Cuba with me because she's a Peruvian Chinese from Peru. So in that sense, she speaks Spanish and English, of course. So that's why I got her to be my interpreter. So language is a very interesting thing, but most other Chinese restaurant owners, of course, if they come from Hong Kong or Taiwan or or China, I would speak one of the dialects. So the only exception is Hakka, which is Mauritius. Your next question was,
how do they take you, looking at you being Chinese or Asian, could be Japanese, but then yet you're Canadian when they find out who you?
No, this is actually the main theme of my Chinese restaurant series and my book, because I started out by saying that I believe in this Chinese saying, within all four seas, all men are brothers. I feel that the diasporic Chinese around the world have this kind of internal connection. I would tell the story of, there's nothing to do with the restaurant, but I would tell a story about, I was in '88 in St. Petersburg, and I was walking down the bridge. And I was on that side of the bridge and the other side of the bridge, and saw this old Chinese man walking down this way. So I went across. I said, well, this is, Chinese in Russia. So I went across to him and started talking to him, and then befriended him. He's somebody who came from China in the 20s. He was like 60 years old, 70-year-old, and he's been there for 50 years. So 60 years. So, he has a Russian wife and has a Russian daughter, and, all that stuff. So he invited me to dinner, and I met his wife and his daughter, and I felt a connection. I said, look, wow, so this is kind of Chinese to Chinese kind of connection that we all have, in a sense. You hear about stories about how Chinese in Southeast Asia will do business with each other on a handshake without any contract, because there's an inherent trust that you're Chinese, I'm Chinese. Okay, we can do business together. We might not speak the same dialect, but we can speak English or whatever it may be. And then there's that kind of, I won't call it tribal, but it's almost bordering on tribalism. In other words, you're from my same tribe. I can trust you. I don't trust somebody else from outside the tribe, but I can trust you because you're from my tribe. So in that sense, imagine this tribe is 1.6 billion people, So that's the kind of thing that I find very, very interesting about the Chinese diaspora, because I feel that way too. Whenever I see somebody, I met some guy in Switzerland, just on the lake. I just walked there. I was walking there. He was walking there, and I started talking to him. I found out he's a, high-level Kuomintang exile. Whatever he was doing there in Switzerland, living in Switzerland. All these people I encounter when I travel, and that's another inspiration of my Chinese restaurant series, is that I felt a interconnectedness between members of the diaspora community, and Chinese being a restaurant is only a portal into that world, because I always joke about, you don't want me to do Chinese dentist, they're so boring, but Chinese restaurant give you the food, all this nice stuff, and it's ubiquitous. So. And then, of course, a lot of people will ask me about, what's so common, what's a common value, and I hate to stereotype. I say, look, I don't want to say what Chinese should be doing, but when it comes down to education, sacrificing yourself for your kids, I mean, these might be very cliche, but I find that very, very common in any country where Chinese. So as I walk in there, I get welcome. It's like, there's another Chinese saying, friends from afar, you should honor them, you should treat them well. So, here I am flying into Mauritius on the first day and haven't met a single person before, just on word of mouth to say, this guy's coming and, please welcome him. So they had a whole banquet for me. They had like 12 people in a big dim sum restaurant. And everybody was like, the leaders of the community all come together. And I even got somebody from the Mauritius Film corporations say, oh, if you come and make the film, I'll give you some money, all kinds of stuff like that. So it's all that kind of, they're anxious to have you come to see them, especially when you're coming from North America. They say, oh, we love people in Canada or US to know about us, because of the pride. They kind of say, look, we're so people in Mauritius only has 1.2, I think the Chinese is like 3% of maybe 1.2 million population. That's not that many people, but they're a proud community. They want the world to know that Chinese Hakkas, we're here, we're in Mauritius, and they are very interesting, so they're right to be proud, and that's why I never have any problem. They always welcome me, except for one restaurant owner in Madagascar. She runs a wonton shop, and it's like out of the Western. You walk in there expecting gunfights. It's in the wood shack. She's been there she's local born, 70 years old. So she's been there. Her parents came as immigrants and so forth. And then I thought, oh, she was perfect. When I first went to Madagascar, I said, look, you're perfect. So it took me 4 days to convince her, say, can I film you? Nah. Anyway, so she chased me away, and I didn't quit because she was the only one I found. So a year later, I brought my crew in. And first day we went to a restaurant, say, hey, Assam, you remember me? I came, oh yeah, but I don't want you filming me. I'm old, I'm ugly, my restaurant's awful, dirty. Don't film me, go somewhere else. So she literally chased us away, like pushing us out of the restaurant, even kind of shoving our cameras away, right? But she said, well, go see this Mrs. Chan. She runs a better restaurant than me. So that's how we ended up with this Mrs. Chan's restaurant, which is a much nicer restaurant and, of course, better food too.
Okay, thank you. And the last question would be identity of being a Canadian. How do you see yourself? Do you see yourself as a Canadian or hyphenated Chinese Canadian?
You're asking me like a professor.
That's the last question. So,
this is a course on Canadian identity or Canadian history. Well, I kind of come to a conclusion that I'm a man of the world kind of thing. I can be home in 6-7 places that I feel at home to, including all the places I've been to. But Canada is very, very, compared to other countries, Canada is the most wonderful in terms of being accepting. Of course, that's a lot after a lot of struggle by our forebears, in a sense. And I was involved in the fight to kind of fight for equality for Chinese Canadians. So I know how hard it is. But I would say Canadians are lucky in the sense that me being Canadian is actually quite lucky, because in other countries you don't even get to fight. You get discriminated, you get racism. Although a lot of people would be happy in the sense that I always ask them, do you feel racism? Do you feel discriminated, by the Peruvians and they all, some of them start crying, yeah, it's never my country. I want to go back to Hong Kong, even though I've been here 40 years, that kind of thing. But yeah, so I think I'm lucky in coming to Canada.
Thank you. There's a question posted by somebody, Cynthia Lam. Was your filmmaking most self-financed? And how many years in total for the 15 episodes? And where were you trained for filmmaking? Were you self-taught?
Pretty much self-taught. I went to New York University for a summer. There was an intensive adult education kind of course. I have 10 weeks, so I did that. But my filmmaking actually my skill actually came from as a photographer. So I go around the world for photographing things. So that's my travel and photography that was my passion. Hence, it translates into quite nicely into filmmaking. But I will tell you that the most important thing is that you can always hire a good cameraman. You can always hire, but it's the managing of the project that is interesting, because I came from an engineering background, so I have a project management background. So I know what to do. I know what, how to face crisis and how to have short budgets and whatnot. So I think that's also important, because when I went to film school, I was with these kids that have no idea. They just want to be a world famous cinematographer, and then that's it, right? So making film is hard, and it doesn't make money. Plus, I never made a film before, so nobody would know who I am to trust me. So I didn't get any money from anybody. I think I got $1,000 from Telefilm after the fact, when I was going to Amsterdam for a film festival, and they say, "Oh, you're representing Canada, so we're going to give you $1,000 travel money." But that's about it. That's the only money I got. So yeah, it's self-finance. And I spent 4 years, 2000 January into August 2003. Started with Saskatchewan and ended up in Lima, Peru. My last country, my last stop. So a 4-year journey. I think I probably travel about 250,000 kilometers, maybe 3 or 4 times around the world. But I also keep it, I try to do, if I went to 13, 14 countries, then it's probably about 3 or 4 countries a year. And then usually it's one big trip for the filming anyway. So yeah.
Labor of love.
Yeah.
So we have another question here from Carl. In the first Chinese restaurant film in Saskatchewan, the man seems quite happy as a community builder. Do you think he is consciously Confucian, or do his admirable ethics come from being raised Chinese?
I think Noisy Jim is unique. I don't think it has anything to do with Chinese or not Chinese, or Confucian, not Confucian. You're talking about Confucianism, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. No, actually, Noisy Jim is the least Chinese that I've met in terms of the only Chinese, the Chinese value that he has, of course, is very common among restaurant owners, is sacrificing for your kids. And then, of course, the next thing was that he doesn't want any of his kids to be, I think he said that in the film, I don't want any of my kids to run a restaurant. They should be engineers and doctors, not running a restaurant, not like me. So, but other than that, I think Noisy Jim is actually the most non-Chinese that I've met in terms of, just because the way he's outgoing, because another stereotype is most Chinese are kind of very more, especially when you're in a foreign country, in a sense, a foreign culture, you tend to be more introvert, or you try to be less aggressive, less mild. But Noisy Jim doesn't care. He just goes around making noise and saying, do this, do this. And he built up on that, and he became a community icon. So, he's the most actually non-Canadian, non-Chinese that I've met in the trip.
Wow. Okay, we have a question from Nan. Is doing business on a handshake a feature only typical of the diaspora, or is it a feature of Chinese or China, Hong Kong as well?
No, not. This is an interesting thing. that I've also explore in my book. People in China look at the diasporic Chinese very differently than we look at ourselves. We like to think that, and a lot of people I talk to, we like to think that, oh, we are Chinese descent, but we might speak different language. We might be born in Canada, but we're still somehow retain our Chineseness. Like having Chinese food or having obedient to your parents or sacrificing and whatnot. All these so-called Chinese characteristics. But people in China, Hong Kong, and Taiwan don't look at you as Chinese. They look at you as foreigners. You have a different passport. You speak different language. Why do I know that? Because my film resonates best in places like Singapore, San Francisco, Vancouver. Because these are diasporic Chinese cities where, if you show Chinese restaurants, I had like every screening in Vancouver was sold out, over 3 festivals, right? So, and people because it resonates with people. It resonates. It's like seeing yourself on TV. One woman from mainland actually told me, after seeing one of my characters kind of miss home, miss his mom. He said that's me. I'm missing my mom. I'm missing Beijing or whatever it may be. So they resonate with the whole experience of diaspora experience because they're here. They know what it means. But people who have never left China or Hong Kong or Taiwan have no idea. They're just, oh, you're not Chinese. You might look Chinese, but you're not Chinese. Chinese is like me. We speak Mandarin or whatever. So they don't have that kind of empathy or resonance as we do for being out there in the world. They have never been out there. So imagine if you're living at a home for ages. You don't know what the outsides look like other than what you see through TV. So you never experience about living outside of home. And especially if you're living outside of home or born outside the home, that you grew up not speaking Chinese or not having that Chinese culture, you make a double effort of trying to, first of all, to assimilate, integrate, but also to make sure that you also retain your Chinese culture. I don't know, Richard keeps nodding. I don't know where you're from, but I'm sure your parents are trying to inculcate you with, being, with Chinese culture, whatever it may be, right? I know where Mina's from, so I know what she's thinking. But it's that kind of thing that we all kind of have. And actually, one of the CBC producer told me, she's Chinese Canadian, born here. She said we all have this cultural baggage that we carry around, almost like a turtle's, back, that you can't shed, but it's hovering over you somewhere, and right here, like you like it or not, you have this Chinese thing in there, even though you never speak Chinese, and yeah. So that's the difference.
I'm going to ask a question of every participant who have watched the film. How do you feel? You can raise your hand and make sure you turn on your microphone. Please go ahead. Richard, I see your hand.
I actually have a question. Sorry, is that okay?
Go ahead, of course.
Sure. So I saw your films back when you released them, I think 2005, 2006 or something like that. And you actually mailed me. I bought them off you from on DVD, and I got it. I saw them that way. And those are the years, and I didn't think I was Chinese enough. And watching your films really helped me find and be confident in my identity, because when you see these films, you go, well, there's a million ways to be Chinese.
Yeah.
And half the films, they don't even speak Chinese in the films. They're speaking the language of that country, and you can't even tell if they even know Chinese anymore or know very much, right?
Right.
And so that was very, just helps with, helps so much at that time. I did have a question. I've been waiting 15 years to ask. You have a Chinese restaurant. You profiled a Chinese restaurant in Turkey, right?
Yeah.
And coming from here, you see sweet and sour pork and all that. How do they deal with not having pork?
Well, it's how they do it in Israel. Same thing. You have kosher Chinese restaurant in Israel. Well, not every Chinese restaurant is kosher in Israel, but they go out and some are and some are not. The one I went to are not. However, they also try to minimize the pork, for example, just to have customers. In Turkey, it's a Muslim family. For those who haven't watched it, thank you, Richard, for being a big fan. But so they're a Muslim family. So no alcohol, no pork in the restaurant. It's just like any Muslim family or actually Muslim in China. They have their own restaurants they go to. They're Muslim Chinese. They call it Muslim Chinese restaurant. That when you walk in there, there's no pork and there's no alcohol. So it's no different. Of course, my guy in Israel substitute chicken for pork for sweet and sour chicken. So that's one way to do it. And I make a big deal about in my Turkey. I don't know if you remember, Richard. I made a big point about pointing out that the dumplings we're eating are beef dumplings, not pork dumplings. Because Chinese always, when you say dumpling in Chinese, it's always assumed to be pork, unless specified otherwise. You can have chicken mushroom dumplings, right? If I say dumplings, it means pork dumplings. But in Turkey, it's beef dumplings by default. So, yeah.
Did you find that the classical Chinese food in each country was different because they've had to adapt it to local taste buds?
Yeah. In fact, in Peru, it's the most interesting case. Peru has Peruvian Chinese food. It's called chifa. And the Peruvian Chinese restaurant is called chifa. So you can say, let's go chifa tonight. That means let's go eat Chinese food tonight. And then let's go to this chifa, like chifa Golden Dragon, right? That means Golden Dragon Chinese restaurant. Now, you know where chifa comes from? It comes from Cantonese, comes from Hakka Sifat, which means to eat rice, to meat. Chifan. It also comes from Cantonese. So in that sense, it's a common Chinese greeting. Have you eaten yet? So, like, have you had your rice yet today? Have you chifa yet? So in that sense, it's a common greeting, as in how are you? The theory goes is that Chinese are so poor, to ask about somebody's well-being is that is your stomach full? Have you had your lunch yet? Have you had your dinner yet? So Peruvians would listen to Chinese in Chinatown talking about this, and they'll coin the word chifa. It's a Peruvian word, means Chinese restaurant or Chinese food or Peruvian Chinese food. And Peruvian, I in my Peru chapter, I talk a little bit. I can deal more on it because the book is coming out next year. Peru actually is my last chapter because that's the last place I went to, and I kind of wrap it up in the whole context of food. And Peruvian Chinese food is very, very unique. It looks like Chinese food. It is, in a sense, roots in Chinese food, but then it's got all kinds of ingredients: Andean chili, Inca, Inca this and that, and so all mixed up, and a little bit of Spanish thrown in there, So it's a very typical, what we we used to call these food fusion. It's not fusion. Fusion means that you really melt these things into a new kind of identity. People now call it hybrid, like hybrid Chinese food. So you have Jamaican Chinese, you have Mauritian Chinese, you have Indo-Hakka Chinese, which I also talk a lot about in my thing. Yeah.
Great.
So it's 8 o'clock our time, 11 o'clock Eastern time. We can say goodbye now, or if people would like to stick around for a little bit longer, but we should ask Cheuk if you're up to it.
I'm okay for another 10 minutes or so. If people don't mind. I love talking to people, that kind of about my film, just because I thought that I really enjoy making the film. It wasn't hardship at all. It was, but certainly I really enjoy having people appreciate what I've done. So I'm happy to stick around for 10 minutes.
Great. I'm gonna ask anyone to share how you feel after you watch the film.
Rob,
The aftertaste.
Rob, and then Megumi.
Does it make you want to go out to eat Chinese food?
Definitely.
You know what? My editors complain to me, says, Cheuk, every time I eat, I spend a few hours cutting. I always want to go out for Chinese lunch.
I don't know what's wrong with that.
Nothing wrong with that.
No. So I just want to share a couple of my, responses about the film about Noisy Jim. One of the things you said right at the beginning that really connected with me is if you go across Canada, if you go to any small town in Canada, you're going to find a Chinese restaurant or cafe. And I think that's probably literally true. So I think that speaks a lot about the ways in which Chinese people in Canada have spread across the country and the ways in which one of the places they found to fit in. So I thought that was pretty interesting. I was really struck by Jim as a character who, he didn't seem to have any sense of having been hard done by or discriminated against. He was very much, as you said, uniquely himself. He fit in incredibly well in the community. He reflected certain family values that you talked about. And I think a lot of other immigrant groups have similar kinds of values, but work hard, make sure your kids get ahead, save all kinds of money, make sure they get educated and progress, and make sure they don't do the same thing that I did to make a living. So I was just struck by the fact that he was such a great human being. And I'm glad you included the bit about how he got to Canada by having to get here under a false identity, because that shows the difficult Underground Railroad that kind of brought him here, that got him here. But I mean, an incredible human being. The one image that was most powerful for me, I think, was the pictures of his funeral. I don't think I've ever seen so many people at a funeral unless it was for Pierre Trudeau or something. It was like the whole town literally was in that auditorium, and you panned across and you showed younger people and older people and school kids and people in sports uniforms. And that was an incredible tribute to a pretty remarkable human being. So thank you for that. And I've spent some time in Mauritius, and actually the person who I worked with as an accountant for many years in Montreal is Chinese from Mauritius. So I'm going to make sure to send him at least your Mauritius film and tell him to look at it, because I'm sure he'll know the people. And it's a remarkable country. It's really a remarkable, very interesting, incredibly successful country for being as small as it is and having no natural resources except the people who are there. But the Chinese community there is, you're right, is a small portion, but they're very well connected and well established and influential across that country. So I will be watching more of these, and thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks, Rob. Megumi? No, you're muted.
Before started, just a moment. This, I want to. Oh, just a moment. I want this film better. Before the session started, I already talked to Mina and Tamiko. My late husband's family are from Saskatchewan. So I have a sister-in-law living in Victoria. I told her about your film, focus on the outlook, Saskatchewan. So she was very interested in. So she's looking forward to watch it. I haven't talked to her yet, but anyway, they're from the north, little bit like northern Saskatchewan, near Lloydminster. So there's a Chinese restaurant there, and her family, my husband has a family, my sister-in-law's family, of course, they used to go to the Lloydminster. That was a treat to go to the Chinese restaurant. And so for her, really fond memory of going to Chinese restaurant in her area. So that's a very, very a good, I think, treat for her. And also, when my late husband and I went to back Japan 1985, we stayed 2 years while he was teaching English. Anyway, then we stayed with my parents in Tokyo, small place. But anyway, point is, every day he ate Japanese food, right? He likes Japanese food, but he likes to get something, different, I think, so I said, well, would you like to eat Canadian food? Let's go find the Canadian food, Then what would you like to eat? I want to eat Chinese food. For him,
Yes.
crazy. A Saskatchewan boy, Chinese food treat was the Chinese food. So we went to Yokohama. Then you went to Chinatown in Yokohama.
Yeah,
Then
like Rob said, this is everywhere.
Yeah, but it was for him not Chinese food. It's different. His Chinese food was Canadian, pretty Chinese food. Very different from the main Chinese food. Chow mein, fried rice, chop suey, that. So anyway, that's my story. Thank you. Really appreciate it.
When I first said that Yokohama Chinatown, I said, "Oh, this is not Chinese food."
Yeah.
But the interesting story now is phenomenon is since the 90s. There's there's a lot of Hakka migration from Mauritius, from Jamaica, and from India. The three biggest, and then the South African Hakka Chinese. There are Peruvian Hakka Chinese who are in Toronto. And I'm sure in Vancouver, you have a huge, I think you have a Jamaican Chinese population. I'm not, if I'm correct. And also, I think you have a South African Chinese population as well. But the food phenomenon, at least in Toronto, I'm not sure about Vancouver, is that this is the whole Indo-Hakka food restaurants run by Hakka people from Jamaica or whatever. And they would cook the Indo version of Hakka food, which is another hybrid cuisine, including the very famous chili chicken, which is invented in Calcutta. So if you go to these restaurants, a good Indo-Hakka restaurant will only have Indian and Pakistani customers. Because that's the Chinese food they know back home. It's just like your
Saskatchewan, pretty.
The only Chinese food he knows is the Saskatchewan, Chinese Canadian food. That to him is what Chinese food is all about.
Yeah.
And I argue that it doesn't matter. We cannot be a purist. We cannot say everybody has to eat like Hong Kong people, right? So, you know, so we should be welcoming in terms of having different kind of Chinese food.
That's why
so
sorry, Mina. Today I heard on the CBC radio, so that's why there's a Asian culinary program at the Vancouver Community College and downtown. So they want to preserve Canadian Chinese food.
Yes.
That's what I heard today.
For recommended reading after the class, there's a book by Anne Hui, Hui. She's actually from Vancouver, and she went from Victoria to Newfoundland, going to all the Chinese Canadian restaurants. And it's in a book called, I'm trying to think of the name of it now.
Chop Suey Nation.
Chop Suey Nation. That's right.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, go buy that book. It will tell you everything you need to know about Chinese Canadian food and the stories behind the restaurants. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
I lived in Red Deer, Alberta for a year, and in small little town like Lookout, that they may serve Chinese Canadian food, right? Like, but if you are Chinese, you go in there and they know you're Chinese, they will cook real Chinese food for you.
That's my trick when I travel. I put my parents in the kitchen. I poke my head in the kitchen and say, "Hey, I'm Chinese from Hong Kong," or whatever. And then I'm sure they won't cheat me by giving me some of the Chinese food. So, but that's yeah.
Okay, we've got almost like a 8:15, and any more question? One last question. I would say that we're gonna take the one last question. Okay. Well, I want to thank Cheuk so much and for being here and answer all the questions. We just enjoyed it so much. I love your film. Like I really, because I can relate to it, that feeling, born in China, lived in Hong Kong and came to Canada. Yeah. So thank you so much. Thank you everyone for being here.
Attention.
Thank you for this program, and thank you, Cheuk. It's just been fabulous.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Go see the rest of the series. It's free.
Yes, I'm looking forward. Yeah, definitely. Thank you so much.
Okay. Thank you for all the people who organized this.
And all the good luck for next year film.
Thank you.
And in your book, I'm looking forward for you to come to Vancouver and launch your book.
I will. Yeah.
Yeah. Please. Yeah. Thank you so much.
I love the title
Bye.
you chose for the book. Have you eaten yet? This is it is so unique as a greeting among Chinese. Have you eaten yet?
Yes, that's right. Yeah, that's the greeting.
You mean like, have you
Yes,
eaten?
I mean,
Okay. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. It's such a tradition.
Yes, we don't do that anymore. But back in China, more like in the village or something like that, people still greet, but not for our generation or younger generation. Is probably even older generation, they don't do that unless you're in a village or some more traditional.
My parents' friend in Montreal, when we met, the husband is still saying, "Have you eaten yet?" It's so colloquial.
Yes.
Yeah.
I'm around some people that say that to me. Yeah.
I heard about Japanese, but Osaka and people, it's really business oriented city, right? For them, have you made money? Mokarimashita ka? That's that's their greeting I have. It's very similar to, have you eaten food? Yeah.
It's hard to answer.
Mokarimaka.
Money.
money.
Enough.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you so much, Mina and
Well,
Tamiko.
thank you very much.
Yeah.
I'll see you next week.
Yep. Same
Good
time.
Yes. Bye-bye.
Okay. Yeah. See you.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, too.
Bye-bye.
Great.
Yeah.
Great to start. Great to start.
Uh-huh.
Thank you, Richard.
No problem. Do you want me to just end it for all now, or?
That's fine. And we'll probably
Okay.
have a meeting sometime next week to go over things. Okay.
Okay, great.
All right. Good
Okay.
night.
Good night. Okay, bye.
Bye.